You don't belong here. The words cut through the marble lobby like a blade, sharp enough to turn heads and freeze conversations mid-sentence, and every eye followed the sound to a woman standing alone at the front desk, dressed in a simple black t-shirt, fitted jeans, and white sneakers that barely made a sound against the polished floor, yet somehow her presence filled the entire room as if she had always owned the space, which in a way she did, though no one there seemed to realize it, not the guests clutching their designer bags, not the concierge pretending not to stare, and definitely not the man behind the counter whose lips curled with quiet authority as he stepped forward and said it again, slower this time, louder, making sure the entire lobby heard him. This is a private property. You need to leave. And when she didn't move, when she didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't even blink, something in his posture shifted from irritation to performance, like he suddenly had an audience worth impressing. And that's when it happened. Not chaos, not a scene, just a single motion that crossed a line no policy ever should, a gesture meant to assert control, quick, dismissive, and loud enough in its impact to echo through the silence that followed, and for a second the entire lobby held its breath, waiting for her to react, to shout, to crumble, to prove them right about whatever assumptions they had already made the moment she walked in. But she didn't. Ava Jackson stood there, still as stone, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, like someone who had seen this moment before, not once, but many times, like someone who understood exactly what was unfolding and had already decided how it would end. A man near the elevators slowly lowered his phone, unsure if he should keep recording. A woman whispered to her husband, "Did that really just happen?" And somewhere behind the desk a young employee hesitated, glancing at the system screen like it might hold a truth no one was ready to hear. But the manager didn't notice any of that. He was too focused on winning a moment he didn't understand, straightening his jacket, raising his voice again. "I said leave now," as if repetition could make him right, as if volume could replace judgment, and still Ava didn't move. Because this wasn't a confrontation to her. It was confirmation of every complaint, every quiet report, every pattern hidden behind polished service and scripted smiles, confirmation that what she had come to test was real. And as the room filled with tension thick enough to feel, she finally exhaled, slow and controlled, the kind of breath that doesn't release pressure but contains it. And in that stillness, in that silence that no one knew how to break, the balance of power had already begun to shift. They just didn't know it yet. The silence did not break all at once. It fractured, quietly, in whispers and shifting glances, as if the entire lobby was trying to decide which version of reality it believed in, the one spoken out loud by the manager or the one standing calmly in front of him. Because Ava Jackson did not move, she did not argue, she did not defend herself, and that unsettled people far more than any outburst ever could. Her stillness felt intentional, like a decision, not hesitation, and the longer it stretched, the more uncomfortable the room became. The concierge behind the desk avoided eye contact, pretending to type, but her fingers hovered above the keyboard without pressing a single key, while a bellman near the entrance shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his posture no longer confident, just uncertain. And somewhere to the right, a young employee named Daniel glanced at the system screen again, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if something there did not match what he had just witnessed. But before he could speak, the manager stepped forward again, closing the distance just enough to reassert control, or at least the illusion of it. "I am not going to repeat myself," he said, his tone sharper now, more controlled, like he was trying to recover authority that had already started slipping through his fingers. "You are not a guest here, and you are not on any list that matters." And that word list lingered in the air like a challenge, because Ava finally shifted. Her gaze, not toward him, but toward the desk, toward the monitor, toward the system that quietly held the truth no one had checked carefully enough. And when she spoke, her voice was low, even, almost measured to the rhythm of her breathing. "Then you might want to check again." It was not a demand, not a threat, just a statement. But something in the way she said it caused Daniel to hesitate, his hand slowly reaching for the keyboard despite the manager's presence. "Do not waste time." The manager snapped, not even looking at him, because he assumed control meant certainty. But Daniel had already begun typing, pulling up the reservation log, scrolling once, twice, his brow tightening as the screen loaded more details. Details that did not fit the narrative being performed in front of everyone. And the longer he looked, the quieter he became, until finally he spoke, barely above a whisper. There is a record. The manager turned sharply, irritation flashing across his face. That is impossible. But Daniel did not look up, his voice steadier now. Executive-level reservation, penthouse suite, name verified. And for the first time, the air shifted in a different direction, not toward conflict, but toward doubt. Real doubt, the kind that spreads faster than any accusation. A woman near the seating area leaned forward, her curiosity no longer hidden. A man by the door took a step closer, and the concierge behind the desk slowly lowered her hands, because the story they had all been told was beginning to crack, and right in the center of it, Ava stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, calm, composed, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, not to prove herself, but to reveal them. The word verified did not echo loudly, but it landed with weight, the kind that shifts posture and rewrites confidence in real time. And for a brief second no one spoke, because the certainty that had filled the room just moments ago was now cracking at the edges. The manager's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the screen, as if staring hard enough might change what was written there. "You are reading it wrong," he said quickly, too quickly, his voice no longer smooth but strained, searching for control that was already slipping. But Daniel did not stop looking. He scrolled further, his fingers slower now, more deliberate, like each line confirmed something he was not prepared to say out loud. "It is not wrong," he replied, louder this time, enough for the nearest guests to hear. "It is marked owner-level clearance." And that word owner did not explode. It spread, quietly, like a ripple across still water, moving from one person to the next, carried in glances, in raised eyebrows, in the subtle shift of bodies leaning in instead of pulling away. The concierge finally looked up fully now, her eyes moving from the screen to Ava, then back again, as if trying to reconcile the image in front of her with the information she had just heard. And still Ava said nothing, because she did not need to. The room was beginning to speak for her. A man near the entrance muttered, "That changes things," and a woman seated by the lounge area added under her breath, "No, that reveals things." And the difference between those two statements hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. But the manager refused to step into that silence. He stepped over it instead, raising his voice again, louder now, sharper, almost defensive. "Systems can be manipulated," he said, his tone forcing certainty where there was none. "People try to access high-tier reservations all the time. This does not prove anything." But even as he spoke, the confidence in the room no longer followed him. It stayed with the screen, with the data, with the quiet presence of the woman he had just tried to remove. And Daniel hesitated again, then turned the monitor slightly, not fully, just enough for the concierge beside him to see. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she quickly composed herself. But it was too late. The reaction had already been seen, already been read. And somewhere behind them another employee whispered, "Is that really her?" The question was not answered, but it did not need to be, because Ava finally shifted her weight, just slightly. A movement so small it should have gone unnoticed, but in that moment it felt like the axis of the room had turned, her gaze lifting from the desk to the manager, steady, unshaken, and when she spoke again her voice carried the same calm as before. But now it held something else, something sharper, not anger, not frustration, but clarity. "You had every chance to check before you judged," she said, each word precise, controlled, "and you chose not to." And that sentence did more than confront him. It exposed him, not just to her, but to everyone watching, because this was no longer about a reservation. It was about a decision, a choice made in seconds that revealed far more than any system ever could. And for the first time since this began, the manager did not respond immediately, because the room was no longer on his side, and he could feel it. The shift was no longer subtle. It moved through the lobby like a quiet current, pulling attention away from authority and toward truth. And for the first time the manager felt it, not as a thought, but as pressure, the kind that tightens the back of your neck when control starts slipping in front of witnesses. "This does not change protocol," he said, his voice sharper now, reaching for structure, for rules, for anything that could rebuild the ground beneath him. But the words sounded thinner than before, less like certainty and more like defense, because the room had already begun to separate what was policy from what was choice. And Ava Jackson stood at the center of that distinction without raising her voice, without stepping forward, without doing anything except allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it was. And that restraint unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could. A guest near the seating area spoke louder now, no longer whispering. If she is verified, why? Was she told to leave? And another voice followed. Why was she treated like that before anyone even checked? The questions did not come from Ava. They came from the room, and that made them harder to dismiss, harder to silence, because they were no longer about one person. They were about everyone watching, and Daniel, still standing at the terminal, swallowed once before speaking again. This time not to the manager, but to the space itself. The reservation is not just active, it is flagged for internal review access, and that phrase carried weight, unfamiliar to most, but unmistakable in its implication. The concierge stepped closer to the screen now, no longer pretending distance, her voice low but clear. That tag is only used for executive audits. And the word audits landed differently than owner had. It did not suggest status, it suggested purpose, intention, design, as if this entire moment had not been random at all. And slowly the realization began to form, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a picture sharpening into focus. Ava had not walked in unprepared, she had walked in watching, measuring, testing, and the manager, still trying to reclaim ground that was no longer his, shook his head slightly, forcing a short laugh that did not reach his eyes. So now we are pretending this is some kind of test, he said, but the question beneath his words was already answering itself, because Ava finally took a step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, just deliberate, closing the distance enough that her presence no longer felt distant or observational but direct, undeniable. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm precision, but now it held something heavier, something final. I did not need to pretend, she said, her eyes locked on his, unshaken. You showed me everything I came here to see. And that sentence did not escalate the moment. It ended it, not with noise, not with force, but with clarity so complete it left no space for argument. And the room understood it before he did, because what had just happened was no longer a misunderstanding, it was a revelation, and everyone in that lobby knew exactly who it revealed. The words settled into the room like a verdict that no one had officially announced, but everyone could feel. And for a moment the manager stood there without speaking, his confidence no longer leading the space, but trailing behind it, trying to catch up to something that had already moved on. And in that silence something older surfaced, not in the room, but in Ava Jackson's memory. A moment from years ago that did not look the same, but felt exactly like this. She was 19, standing in the lobby of a boutique hotel just outside Atlanta, wearing a pressed blouse and carrying a folder filled with internship documents, hopeful, prepared, and completely invisible to the man behind the desk who glanced at her once and said, "You might be more comfortable waiting outside." Not because there was no space, not because there was a rule, but because he had already decided who she was before she spoke. And she remembered standing there, holding her words back, feeling the weight of something she could not yet name, something that followed her through boardrooms and bank offices and quiet elevators where eyes measured before voices welcomed. And now, years later, that same weight tried to return, but it did not land. The same, because she was not the same. She had built too much, seen too much, owned too much of her own narrative to let a moment like this define her again. And back in the present the room continued to shift. A guest near the front desk shook his head slowly. "This is not about a reservation," he said, and someone else added, "It never was." And those words carried across the marble floor like a quiet agreement forming among strangers, while Daniel stepped back from the terminal, no longer uncertain, his voice steady now. "The system has already logged this interaction," he said, glancing briefly at Ava before looking back at the manager. "Everything from the moment she entered is time-stamped." And that detail landed differently. It was not emotional. It was factual, and facts have a way of stripping away performance, of leaving only what actually happened. And the manager's posture shifted again, not forward, not authoritative, but inward, as if he was recalculating in real time, searching for a version of events that would still place him in control. "You are escalating something unnecessarily," he said, but the statement no longer carried weight. It sounded like a request disguised as a command, because the room had already decided what it was witnessing, and Ava, still calm, still composed, finally lifted her phone, not dramatically, not to threaten, just to act, her thumb tapping once, then again, precise, intentional, and when she spoke her voice remained even, but now it carried direction, purpose, something structured beyond the room itself. "Carla," she said, "begin full internal review, priority level 1. There was no hesitation on the other end, only a clear response that carried through the quiet space. "Confirmed, review initiated, all systems syncing now." And in that moment the air changed again, not with tension, but with inevitability. Because this was no longer a situation that could be argued away or explained down, it was being documented, processed, and escalated beyond anyone standing in that lobby. And Ava lowered her phone slightly, her gaze steady, her presence grounded, as if she had simply opened a door that had always been there. And the room understood, even before anything else happened, that what came next would not be decided by voices, but by truth. The confirmation did not come with noise. It came with signals, subtle at first, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The terminal behind the desk refreshed once, then again, small icons flickering in the corner of the screen as the system synchronized in real time. And Daniel noticed it immediately, his posture straightening as if the machine itself had just validated everything he had been trying to say. "It is updating," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, but the words carried. And the concierge leaned closer, her voice low but tense. "Priority. Sync does not trigger unless it is corporate level." And that single clarification shifted the weight of the moment even further, because corporate meant oversight, and oversight meant consequences, and across the lobby phones were no longer being lowered, they were being raised, not dramatically, not aggressively, just enough to capture what was unfolding, a quiet acknowledgement that something important was happening in real time. The kind of moment people do not interrupt, they witness, and the manager felt it now, not just the attention, but the shift in who held it. His voice came again, but it no longer filled the space the same way. "This is unnecessary escalation," he said, but the words sounded smaller, contained, like they had nowhere left to expand, because the room had already moved past whether this should be happening and into understanding why it was. Ava Jackson stood exactly where she had been, her posture relaxed but grounded, her presence steady like someone who had already seen the end of the story and was simply allowing everyone else to catch up. And then her phone spoke again, Carla's voice clear, efficient, unmistakably structured. "Full review is active, internal logs are secured, employee access levels are being cross-checked now." There was no emotion in the delivery, just process, just precision, and that made it more powerful than any raised voice could have been. Because this was not personal, it was systemic, and systems do not argue, they record, they verify, they act. And the concierge took a small step back from the desk, her earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, something closer to realization, while Daniel's eyes remained locked on the screen, reading updates as they appeared. "Access history is being pulled," he added, almost involuntarily, as if narrating what the system itself was revealing, and a guest near the entrance exhaled slowly. "This just got serious," he said, not loudly, but enough, because everyone already felt it. The moment had crossed a line from confrontation into accountability, and the manager, standing at the center of what he no longer controlled, adjusted his stance again. But there was no version of authority left to step into, only reactions to what was already in motion. "You are making assumptions based on incomplete data," he tried. But even he did not sound convinced anymore, because the data was no longer incomplete, it was unfolding in front of him, line by line, timestamp by timestamp. And Ava finally looked toward the desk again, not at the screen, but at the people behind it, her voice calm, almost quiet, but carrying through the entire lobby with unmistakable clarity. "No," she said. "I am letting the system speak." And that was the moment everything settled, not resolved, not finished, but set. like a decision that had already been made beyond the reach of anyone in that room, and all that remained was for it to arrive. The room did not erupt, it tightened, like everything was being pulled into a single point of truth that no one could step around anymore. And then it happened, not with a shout, not with a dramatic gesture, but with a quiet sound that carried more weight than any voice in the room. The manager's access badge on his chest flickered once, then turned a solid, unmistakable red, and for a second he did not notice, but Daniel did. His eyes lifting from the screen, widening just slightly. Your access, he began, but the sentence did not need to finish, because the terminal refreshed again, this time displaying a notification across the top of the system. Bold, official, irreversible, access privileges suspended pending executive review. And the words hung there, not just on the screen but in the air, visible in the way the concierge took a step back, in the way the bellman near the door straightened without knowing why, in the way the quiet murmurs in the room shifted from confusion to understanding, because this was no longer speculation, it was confirmation, and Ava Jackson had not moved. She had not raised her voice, she had not demanded anything. She had simply allowed the system to arrive exactly where it was always going. And her phone vibrated once in her hand. A small, controlled interruption. She lifted it, listened for a brief moment, then lowered it again, her gaze steady as she spoke, her voice calm but carrying through every corner of the lobby. For clarity, she said, each word measured, deliberate. I am Ava Jackson. She paused, not for effect, but because the room needed a second to hold what came next. I am the owner of this property. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realization, full of recalculation, full of every assumption collapsing at once. Under the weight of a single truth, a guest near the lounge exhaled audibly. Another lowered their phone slowly, not because the moment was over, but because it had already been captured, already understood, and the manager stood there, the red light on his badge now impossible to ignore, his expression shifting from resistance to something closer to disbelief, as if the reality in front of him refused to align with the story he had been telling himself just minutes ago. That is not, he started, but the words did not finish, because there was nothing left to argue against. The system had already spoken, the room had already seen, and Ava's presence now carried no ambiguity, only authority, not loud, not aggressive, but absolute. And Daniel stepped back from the desk completely, creating space without being told. The concierge followed, instinctively, as if the hierarchy of the room had just rewritten itself in real time. And Ava looked at the manager, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a clarity that cut deeper than either. You decided who I was before you checked, she said quietly. And now you are seeing who you chose to ignore. And that was the moment the power fully shifted, not announced, not declared, just understood by everyone standing there, because the truth had finally stepped forward, and it did not need permission. The shift was immediate and irreversible, not because of anything Ava said next, but because of what the system continued to do without asking anyone in the room for permission. The terminal refreshed again, this time cascading with updates that moved faster than any human explanation could follow. Employee profiles flagged, access logs expanded. Internal alerts triggered across departments that were not even physically present, and Daniel stepped back another inch, almost instinctively, as if the screen itself had become something to respect. Multiple accounts are being reviewed, he said quietly, his voice no longer uncertain but careful, aware that every word now carried weight. The concierge looked at the manager, then at the screen, then back at Ava, her composure fully replaced with realization. Because what was unfolding was no longer about a single interaction. It was about a pattern, and patterns do not hide when systems are watching. They surface, line by line, detail by detail, and Ava stood there, not reacting to each update, not following the noise, because she already understood what it meant. Her focus remained steady, her presence unchanged, while her phone vibrated again. A second confirmation. She listened briefly, then spoke with the same calm authority that had guided every moment so far. Proceed with full personnel review, she said, her tone even, controlled. Start with management level. There was no hesitation in the response, only acknowledgement, and almost instantly the system reflected it. Another notification appearing across the screen. Management credentials under audit review. Temporary suspension initiated, and this time the reaction in the room was visible, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. A guest near the entrance let out a low breath. Another shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in recognition of what was happening. Because the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were active, unfolding in real time, and the manager, standing at the center of it, looked down at his badge again, then at the terminal, then at Ava, his posture no longer defensive but uncertain, as if the space he had controlled just minutes ago no longer recognized him at all. "This cannot be happening over a misunderstanding," he said. But even as he spoke, the word misunderstanding sounded hollow, because nothing about this felt accidental anymore. And Ava met his gaze, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity that left no room for interpretation. "It is not happening because of a misunderstanding," she said quietly. "It is happening because of a pattern." And that word landed heavier than anything else, because patterns are not moments. They are habits, decisions repeated often enough to become invisible until someone decides to look. And now the system was looking, not just at him, but at everything connected to him. Every action, every report, every choice that had once been dismissed or ignored. And the room understood it all at once, not in pieces, not gradually, but completely. This was not about one incident. This was about everything that had led to it. And as the screen continued to update, as the notifications continued to appear, one after another, the balance of power did not just shift, it settled, firmly, permanently, exactly where it had always belonged. The update slowed, not because the system had less to say, but because it had already said enough, the truth no longer arriving in fragments but standing fully formed in the center of the room, undeniable and complete. And the lobby, once filled with assumptions and quick judgments, now held something quieter, something heavier, a kind of awareness that does not fade once it settles in. Ava Jackson stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, unchanged in posture, unchanged in tone. But everything around her had shifted to meet the reality she had always carried. The manager no longer spoke, not because he had nothing to say, but because there was nothing left that could change what had already been revealed. His badge still dimmed, his access gone, his authority reduced to a memory that no longer applied, and the employees around him adjusted without instruction, stepping back, creating space, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The structure they had followed had just been rewritten in real time, and across the lobby the guests who had once been silent observers now stood with a different kind of attention, not curiosity, not entertainment, but understanding, because they had witnessed something rare, not just a reversal of power, but a correction of it. And Ava finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a single step forward, enough to stand where the center of the room had always been, her voice calm, steady, carrying without force. "This was never about removing someone from a lobby," she said, her eyes moving briefly across the room, acknowledging not individuals but the moment itself. "It was about how quickly someone is dismissed when they are assumed not to belong." And the words settled deeper than anything before, because they did not accuse, they explained, they did not attack, they revealed, and she paused for just a second, not for effect, but because the weight of what had happened deserved space to be understood. "You did not need to know who I was," she continued, her gaze returning to the manager, not harsh, not forgiving, just clear. "You needed to know how to treat someone you thought did not matter." And that sentence closed something in the room, not with noise, not with applause, but with a quiet finality that no one could step around, because it reached beyond the moment, beyond the lobby, into something larger that everyone present recognized in their own way. And her phone vibrated one last time. A final confirmation. She glanced at it briefly, then lowered it. No reaction needed. The process was complete. The system had done what it was designed to do, and Ava turned slightly, not away from the moment, but through it, as if stepping forward into what came next instead of standing inside what had already ended. And as she walked, the space did not close behind her. It opened, not physically, but in understanding, because what remained in that lobby was not tension, not conflict, but a standard that had just been raised without a single shout, without a single demand, only through truth. And in that quiet, unmistakable shift. Everyone there understood one thing clearly. Power does not always need to speak loudly to be heard. Sometimes it only needs to stand still long enough for everything else to reveal itself around it.